$8,000. That was all that stood between me and an operating table. My son had just helped close a $12 million deal. Yet when I asked him for help, he told me he couldn't spare a single dollar for his own father. I thought hearing him say no was the betrayal. 6 weeks later, I learned that his $12 million deal had something to do with me, and suddenly, the $8,000 was the least of my problems. My name is Josh Peters. I'm 63, a retired roofer living alone in a modest two-bedroom house in Tucson's Blenman Elm neighborhood, not far from Grant Road and Reed Park. That Thursday evening in June, the heat was still hanging over the city long after sunset. The monsoon hadn't arrived, the desert was bone dry, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of mail I'd been putting off opening. There was a notice from Tucson Electric Power, a reminder from my dentist, and underneath both of them, a thick envelope from my insurance company. I hadn't opened it yet, but something about it made my stomach tighten. Then my phone rang. It was a video call from Ethan. My son almost never called on video unless he had something he wanted me to see. His face filled the screen, and behind him was a crowded bar glowing with string lights, people laughing and raising drinks. "Dad, you're not going to believe what happened today." He was grinning so hard I barely had time to answer. "We closed the Cortez Ridge deal. $12 million. My name is on the closing memo." "Ethan, that's incredible." And I meant it. Whatever had gone wrong between us over the years, I had never stopped wanting my son to succeed. "Ashford Meyer is throwing a celebration tonight," he said. "I've got to go, but I wanted you to be the first person I told." Someone shouted his name from across the bar. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, already distracted. "Love you, Dad. Talk soon." Then the screen went dark. I sat there for a moment staring at my phone. I didn't know what Cortez Ridge was, and I didn't think to ask. To me, it was just another expensive project my successful son had helped close. 6 weeks later, I would see that name again, only this time, it wouldn't be on Ethan's closing memo. It would be attached to something that led straight back to me. I sat alone in the kitchen after Ethan hung up, the phone still warm in my hand. I wasn't jealous of his success. It was something harder to admit, like standing outside a window, watching your own family celebrate a life you were no longer part of. Then I coughed, hard enough that I had to brace a hand against the table. It was probably the fourth time that hour. The cough had been hanging around for nearly 3 weeks, but I kept blaming Tucson's dry air and the dust that always seemed worse before monsoon season. My daughter Hannah didn't believe that for a second. 2 nights later, she walked through my door, carrying a foil pan of green chile stew, the recipe our neighbor Rosa Wilson had taught her years ago. Hannah was 29, worked as a hospice nurse for a home care agency off Alvernon Way, and had spent most of her life refusing to let me lie to myself. I coughed while she was setting the food on the counter. She stopped immediately. "You're still doing that." "It's the dust, baby." For 3 weeks, she folded her arms, and for a second she looked so much like her mother that I forgot what I was about to say. "You're seeing Dr. Alvarez Saturday." I already called. "Hannah, don't argue with me, old man. I'll drive you there myself." That ended the discussion. We ate together at the kitchen table, and for a little while, everything felt normal again the way it had before her mother died, before Ethan moved to Phoenix, and somehow started treating me more like an obligation than his father. Hannah told me about an 81-year-old patient named Walter she had lost that week. Even near the end, he would whistle old Tucson radio jingles from the 1950s, and she admitted losing patients still broke her heart no matter how many times she went through it. "How do you keep doing that?" I asked. "Watching people die every day." Hannah barely hesitated. "Somebody has to sit with them, Dad. Nobody should die alone." I remembered those words later. At the time, I just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Saturday morning, Hannah made sure I kept the appointment. Dr. Nathan Alvarez ran a small practice off Broadway Boulevard, the kind of place with a fish tank in the waiting room and a receptionist who knew your name before opening your chart. "Doctor." Alvarez listened to my chest, moved the stethoscope, listened again, then went back to the same spot. The longer he stayed quiet, the less I liked it. Finally, he pulled the earpieces out. "Josh, I want imaging done today." "Today?" He was already writing the order. "If they can fit you in, yes." A few hours later, I was sitting inside a scanning machine, at a facility several blocks away. When it was over, I climbed into my 2011 Silverado, turned the key, and sat in the parking lot with the air conditioner coughing out warm air. I told myself Dr. Alvarez was being cautious. Doctors checked things. That was their job. 4 days later, my phone rang. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something had changed. "Josh, I need you to come in Monday." There was a pause. "We found a mass." I gripped the phone tighter. He didn't bury me in medical language or pretend there was nothing to worry about. "I want to be straightforward with you. It's operable. That's the good news. But we need to move quickly." "How quickly?" Another pause. "Weeks, Josh, not months." A few days earlier, $8,000 had been nothing more than a number I didn't have. Now I was about to find out exactly what that number could cost me. Monday confirmed exactly what Dr. Alvarez had feared. There was a mass where no mass belonged, and the surgical team wanted me in an operating room within 3 weeks. For a few minutes, I actually felt relieved. It was operable. There was a plan. Then Patricia Nunez from the billing office walked in carrying a folder, and I learned that surviving something and being able to afford it were two different problems. "Mr. Peters, I need to explain your coverage." She opened the folder and showed me where my insurance stopped helping. The surgical approach Dr. Alvarez recommended fell into a different coverage category, which meant the hospital required an upfront deposit before the team would reserve an operating room. "How much?" I asked. Patricia hesitated. $8,000. I stared at her. "Before they schedule the surgery?" "Before they reserve the date. The remaining balance can be handled through a payment plan afterward, but the deposit has to be paid up front." $8,000. I had $2,100 in savings. That was everything I had managed to keep tucked away after decades of roofing work, retirement, bills, and all the little expenses that slowly eat through a working man's bank account. I walked out to my truck and sat behind the wheel without starting it. Outside, heat shimmered above the asphalt. Inside, I opened my banking app and stared at the number as if looking at it long enough might somehow change it. $2,100. I needed $8,000. I was $5,900 short, and the doctors were talking about weeks, not months. I considered credit cards, loans, anything that might close the gap, but my credit wasn't what it used to be and there wasn't enough time to rebuild it. Then Ethan's video call came back to me. $12 million. Cortez Ridge. A bar full of people celebrating while my son smiled into the camera and told me his name was on the closing memo. I told myself I wouldn't call him. For 2 days, I searched for another way, because asking your own child for money does something to a father's pride, especially when that child has spent years making you feel like you belong on the edge of his life. But every road led back to the same number. $5,900 short, surgery waiting, clock running. So I finally picked up the phone and called my son. Ethan answered on the 4th ring. Music spilled through the speaker, followed by laughter and the sharp clink of glasses. They were still celebrating. "Dad, can this wait? We're doing another thing for the Cortez Ridge deal." "No, Ethan, it can't." Something in my voice must have reached him because the background noise suddenly faded. I heard a door close. "Okay, what happened?" I told him everything. The cough, the scan, the mass, the surgery they wanted done within 3 weeks. Then I explained the insurance gap and the deposit the hospital needed before they would put me on the schedule. "How much?" he asked. $8,000. Silence. "I've got $2,100 saved. I'm trying to cover the rest, but I'm running out of time." More silence. I hated what I had to say next, but I said it anyway. "Ethan, I need your help." Nothing came through the phone except the faint music behind him. This was the same son who had called me days earlier to celebrate a $12 million deal. The same son who said he loved me. And now, with his father asking for help getting onto an operating table, Ethan didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He just stayed silent long enough for me to realize I might already have my answer. The silence on Ethan's end stretched long enough that I made the mistake of hoping. For 1 second, I imagined him doing the math, $12 million on one side, his father's surgery on the other, and deciding there was only one answer. Then his voice changed. Dad, we just closed a $12 million deal. You understand that isn't my money, right? It's the fund's money. I've got the mortgage on the Phoenix place. I've got. He stopped himself. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. There's no money for you, Dad. I wish there was, but there isn't. There's no money for you, Dad. I would replay those words more times than I care to admit. It's $8,000, son, not 800,000. You don't get it. Now there was anger in his voice. I spent my whole childhood watching you put every spare dollar back into Frank's company instead of this family. I'm not doing that math again. I can't keep bailing you out. Bailing me out? I gripped the phone. Ethan, I'm asking for help with surgery. I have to go, Dad. The call ended. I stayed at the kitchen table with the dead phone in my hand, staring at the same unopened mail while something inside me broke that had nothing to do with the mass in my chest. Ethan hadn't always been this man. I still remembered the little boy riding beside me in my truck on Saturday mornings, passing me nails on roofing jobs and looking at me like there wasn't anything his father couldn't fix. Somewhere along the way, I lost that boy. 2 nights later, Hannah showed up without calling. She took one look at me and stopped inside the doorway. What happened? I told her everything, the diagnosis, the hospital deposit, and every word her brother had said. Hannah stood silently for a moment, jaw tight. Then she pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. Hannah, don't. Her fingers kept moving. I sold the Civic. I stared at her. You did what? Sold it 2 days ago. I've been taking the bus to work. She said it like she had switched brands of coffee, not given up her only car. I had some savings too. Between that and the car, I can give you $6,000 right now. Absolutely not. I'm not taking your car money. She finally looked up. You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you. Hannah. Dad, you spent my entire life making sure I had what I needed. Let me do this one thing. For a second, I saw her mother in her face, the same stubborn look she wore 20 years earlier when a contractor tried to cheat me on a roofing job. There was no winning this argument. Hannah had $6,000. We were still $2,000 short. I sat there looking at my daughter, a hospice nurse, who had just sold her only car to help keep her father alive, while her brother, the man celebrating a $12 million deal, wouldn't contribute a dollar. Something inside me went quiet. I didn't know it then, but that was the last moment in this story I would ever feel like the poorest man in the room. I found the remaining $2,000 the same way I had found almost everything else in my life, the hard way. I emptied what was left of my emergency savings and sold a set of roofing tools I hadn't touched in 3 years to a young contractor starting his own crew. Piece by piece, Hannah and I scraped together the $8,000. I thought that meant the worst problem in front of me was finally solved. I was wrong. By Friday, Hannah and I had the money. I walked into Rincon Valley Medical Center's billing office and handed Patricia Nunez a cashier's check for $8,000. She checked the amount, gave me a small smile, and said, "We'll get you scheduled." For the first time in 2 weeks, I could breathe without thinking about money. Surgery was set for Monday. Hannah took 2 days off work to stay with me, and considering she spent her career sitting beside people through the hardest moments of their lives, I knew exactly what that meant. I won't drag you through every hour of the hospital stay. The surgery was long, recovery was worse, and after enough time staring upward, every ceiling tile starts looking like the one beside it. But when the anesthesia finally began to wear off, the first thing I saw was Hannah sitting in a chair pulled tight against my bed. Her hand was wrapped around mine like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. Ethan wasn't there. He called the next day. 4 minutes. He asked how I was feeling, told me he was glad the surgery went well, then filled the rest of the call with small talk. He never mentioned the $8,000. Neither did I. A man can only ask his own son for help so many times before pride starts sounding better than another no. I was angry, but anger doesn't do much for you in a hospital bed. It just gives you one more thing that hurts. Recovery took about 2 weeks. Hannah checked on me every day, sometimes before her shift, sometimes after, always carrying food and wearing that same expression that told me not to bother arguing. By the second week of July, I was mostly myself again. I moved slower on the stairs, but the cough was finally gone, and sitting around the house was beginning to drive me crazy. So I started walking the neighborhood early in the morning before the Tucson heat became unbearable. Same streets, Same saguaros. Same houses I'd passed for years. Then one Monday morning, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope that didn't belong with the usual bills. Thick paper. Phoenix return address. 3 words printed in the corner stopped me cold. Cortez Ridge Holdings. I stared at the name. 6 weeks earlier, Ethan had been standing in a crowded bar celebrating Cortez Ridge like it was the biggest victory of his career. Now they were sending something directly to me. I tore the envelope open before I even made it back inside. The first paragraph made no sense, so I read it again. Then a third time. The letter came from an attorney representing Cortez Ridge Holdings. According to their records, I was a minority equity holder in Saguaro Roofing and Construction Supply, the company where I had spent nearly 24 years of my life. Back in 2005, when business was tight and the owner, Frank DeLuca, couldn't afford to give his longtime foreman a proper raise, he had offered me a small ownership stake instead. I accepted it, signed the paperwork, and barely thought about it afterward. I had never considered myself an investor. I was a roofer who happened to own a small piece of the company he helped build. But Saguaro had recently been acquired by Cortez Ridge Holdings, and that acquisition had triggered a payout on my ownership position. I stood beside my mailbox under the Arizona sun and found the number near the bottom of the page. I read it once, then again, slower. $1.8 million. 6 weeks earlier, I had needed $8,000 to get onto an operating table, and my son had told me there was no money for me. Now I was holding a letter connected to his $12 million deal telling me that I was owed more than $1.8 million. But the money wasn't the part that made my hands start shaking. It was one question I couldn't get out of my head. If Ethan helped close the Cortez Ridge acquisition, how could he possibly not know his own father was one of the people getting paid? 20 years earlier, Frank DeLuca couldn't afford to pay me what an experienced foreman was worth, so he offered me something unusual instead. 8% of Saguaro Roofing and Construction Supply. Back then, it was just paperwork from a small roofing company fighting to stay alive. Over the years, I had plenty of chances to cash out. I never did. Whenever my share produced money, I rolled it back into the business. That was why I could spend decades working and still have only $2,100 sitting in an emergency account. I wasn't broke because I owned nothing. Almost everything I had built was buried inside a company I believed in. I just never imagined that little 8% stake would someday become worth $1.8 million. I hadn't spoken to Frank in nearly 2 years. He had retired to Green Valley, about half an hour south of Tucson, and somewhere along the way we had stopped calling each other. But that afternoon, I drove straight to his house with the Cortez Ridge letter on the passenger seat, still half convinced somebody had made a very expensive mistake. Frank was sitting on his back patio when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered, but the second he saw me climbing out of the Silverado, he grinned. "Josh Peters, I was wondering when you'd show up." I held up the letter. "Tell me this is real." He barely glanced at it. "Cortez Ridge? It says they owe me more than $1.8 million. Frank leaned back in his chair like I'd just told him tomorrow's weather. "Sounds about right." I stared at him. "Frank, I had $2,100 in the bank 2 weeks ago." He laughed. "And you had 8% of Saguaro sitting there for 20 years. You never cashed out, Josh. You kept reinvesting. That stake grew with the company." He told me Cortez Ridge had approached them about 8 months earlier with an acquisition offer too good to ignore. He had even tried to contact me as the deal moved toward closing, but his calls came from a Phoenix number and I'd ignored them, assuming they were robocalls. Then Frank mentioned something that changed the entire conversation. Ashford Meyer handled the deal. I stopped moving. "What did you say?" "Ashford Meyer Capital, Phoenix firm. They brokered the acquisition, worked the financing, handled most of the transaction." For a moment, I just stared across Frank's backyard. Ashford Meyer Capital, Ethan's firm, the same company throwing the celebration the night my son called me. The same Cortez Ridge deal he had proudly told me was worth $12 million. The deal he was still celebrating when I called to tell him I needed surgery. And now I finally understood what had been sitting in front of me the entire time. My son's biggest deal hadn't merely happened around the same time I needed $8,000. His deal was the sale of the company I owned 8% of. The transaction Ethan celebrated had just made his father a millionaire. I drove back to Tucson after dark, with the windows down and the desert air rolling through the truck. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call Hannah either. For 2 days, I told nobody about the $1.8 million. Not because I wanted revenge, and not because I was planning some grand punishment. I needed to understand exactly what had happened before I decided what came next. One question kept following me home. Ethan worked on the deal. My ownership was part of the acquisition, and my name had to exist somewhere in that paperwork. So when my son told me, "There's no money for you, Dad," had he truly not known what I owned, or had he known exactly what was coming? I called Hannah first. Not because I was ready to talk about the money, but because after everything that had happened, I needed to see my daughter. She came over Wednesday carrying a bag of groceries she had no business buying on a hospice nurse's salary. She was halfway through putting them away when I finally said it. "Hannah, I need to tell you something." She turned toward me. "What?" "That company I worked for all those years was sold. I still owned 8%. She waited. "My share is worth a little over $1.8 million. Hannah slowly lowered the carton of eggs in her hands onto the counter. $1.8 million? A little more, according to the attorney. There's paperwork left. I'm putting it into a trust." Her face changed. "Dad, a month ago you had $2,100. I sold my car because we couldn't come up with $8,000 for your surgery." "I know." I reached across the table and took the same hand that had held mine when I woke up after surgery. "You sold your only car for me. You rode the bus to work for 2 weeks so I could get onto that operating table. I've spent the last 2 days thinking about what this money should mean, and I've made my decision." She was already shaking her head. "Dad, don't. The money is going to you." She stared at me. "All of it?" "No, absolutely not. It's already being done. I met with an attorney yesterday. Once I sign the trust, it's irrevocable. Dad, I didn't help you because I wanted anything back." "I know. That's exactly why I'm doing it." That broke her. Hannah started crying right there at my kitchen table, and I pulled her into my arms. It wasn't really about $1.8 million. It was about the daughter who gave up what little she had when I had almost nothing, without asking what she would get in return. I thought about Susan and how proud her mother would have been of the woman standing in front of me. The trust was finalized on a Monday in late July. That was when I discovered Hannah had hidden something from me. The $6,000 from her savings and the sale of her Civic hadn't been enough to cover everything surrounding my surgery. So she had taken out a payday loan at an interest rate that made my blood boil. She never told me. My attorney found it while we were organizing the financial paperwork. I paid it off immediately. Then I cleared what remained on her apartment lease, set aside money for the tutoring program for underprivileged kids she had wanted to start for 2 years, and bought her another car. Nothing luxurious. Just something reliable enough that my daughter would never again be standing at a bus stop before sunrise because she had sold her car to save my life. The rest remained protected in the trust for Hannah. As far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. But there was one thing I hadn't considered. Ashford Meyer Capital handled the ownership records for the deals it closed. About 10 days after my trust was finalized, someone in their Phoenix office ran a routine post-closing report on the Saguaro acquisition. My name appeared on it, not buried near the bottom. According to the report, Josh Peters was the largest individual payout in the entire transaction. I can only imagine how quickly that information traveled through the office. A junior associate sees the number. Someone notices the last name. Somebody says Peters, out loud. And somewhere nearby sits Ethan Peters, the man who helped close the deal. 3 days later, on a Wednesday evening, a car pulled up outside my house. I looked through the window and watched my son climb out. Ethan hadn't come to see me when I needed surgery. He hadn't come when Hannah sold her car. He hadn't come when I was recovering in a hospital bed. But somehow, once $1.8 million entered the story, he found the time to drive all the way from Phoenix to my front door. Ethan didn't call first. He didn't knock like someone coming to check on his father either. He hammered on my front door hard enough that I heard it from the kitchen. When I opened it, my son was standing on the porch in a suit that probably cost more than my Silverado, face red, jaw clenched. "You want to explain something to me?" he snapped before I had the door fully open. "Come inside, Ethan." "No. I want to know why my father's name showed up on the cap table of a deal I closed." His voice rose. $1.8 million, Dad. You owned 8% of Saguaro this entire time and never told me. Not when I was taking out loans for college. Not even when you called me begging for $8,000 for surgery. I wasn't begging, and you're going to watch how you speak to me in my own house. He pushed past me into the kitchen anyway. I let him. This conversation had been coming from the moment that report landed on somebody's desk in Phoenix. Ethan turned on me. You let me refuse you. You let me look like the bad guy for not bailing out a father who apparently had almost $2 million sitting in equity. I didn't have $2 million, Ethan. When I called you, the deal hadn't closed. I didn't know what my stake was worth. I found out after surgery when Cortez Ridge sent me a letter. Convenient. No. True. I pointed toward the table. Sit down. He stayed on his feet. A month earlier, Hannah had stood in that same kitchen and offered me everything she had. Now Ethan stood in the same spot, furious because he had discovered I had something he wanted. Then he finally asked the question that told me exactly why he had driven from Phoenix. So where's my share? I looked at him for a second, hoping I had heard wrong. No apology for hanging up on me. No question about whether the surgery had worked. No thank you to the sister who had stepped in when he wouldn't. Just one question. Where's my share? There isn't one. His expression froze. Excuse me? The trust is finalized. Irrevocable. Every dollar from the payout went to Hannah. The color drained from his face before rushing back twice as hard. You gave Hannah all of it? She sold her car for me. She emptied her savings. Then I found out she'd taken a payday loan, just to help cover what I couldn't. She did all of that without asking what she'd get back. Ethan shook his head. That money should have been divided between us. I'm your son. Yes, you are. You'll always be my son. But being my son doesn't automatically entitle you to everything I spent 20 years building. So this is punishment? No. This is consequence. I stepped closer. When I needed $8,000 to get on an operating table, you told me there was no money for me. Now, you found out I have $1.8 million, and the first thing you want to know is how much belongs to you. Listen to yourself. His hand slammed against my kitchen table. You're going to regret this. You're tearing this family apart over your pride. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. This family didn't fall apart tonight, Ethan. It fell apart when your father told you he needed surgery. You said there was no money for him, and then you went back to your celebration. Tonight is just the first time I've said it out loud. Ethan stared at me without answering. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains, deep enough to shake the windows. Tucson's first real monsoon storm of the season was finally coming. Ethan looked at me one last time, and whatever I saw in his face told me this wasn't over. Not even close. The first drops hit the roof while Ethan was still standing in my kitchen. After 2 months of dry Tucson heat, the storm everyone had been waiting for was finally breaking over the city. I looked at my son, and by then I didn't have enough anger left to shout. I needed help, Ethan. My voice was quiet, and I called you first. Before Hannah. Before anybody. I called you because you're my son, and some part of me still believed that when it really mattered, you would show up. He said nothing. You didn't. Hannah did. That isn't revenge. It isn't favoritism. It's simply what happened. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a few seconds, he looked like he was searching for one last argument, something that could turn the whole thing back on me. Nothing came. I opened the door. Get out of my house, Ethan. He walked past me without another word. A moment later, his car tore out of the driveway hard enough to leave rubber on the asphalt. Then he was gone. I sat alone at the kitchen table while the storm finally opened over Tucson, rain pounding against the roof I hadn't climbed in years. My mind went back 20 years to Frank DeLuca handing a stubborn foreman a piece of paper offering him 8% of a struggling roofing company because he couldn't afford a proper raise. Neither of us could have imagined what that signature would become. The next morning, Hannah called. Somehow she had already heard Ethan had driven down from Phoenix furious, and like always, her first concern was me. Are you okay? I'm fine, baby. She hesitated. He's not going to forgive you for this. I know. And you're okay with that? I looked through the window. The storm clouds were drifting east toward the Rincon Mountains, and after months of dust, everything outside finally looked washed clean. When I needed help, I called your brother first. He told me no. Then you showed up with $6,000 after selling your car without even knowing whether I could ever pay you back. I don't need Ethan to forgive me for giving the money to the person who showed me what family meant when I had nothing to offer in return. Hannah went quiet. I wish he understood. So do I. But forgiveness and understanding aren't the same thing. I've made peace with the fact that I may never get either one from him. Another pause. Then she said softly, I love you, Dad. I love you too, baby. Now get some sleep. You've got patients tomorrow who need you more than I do. After we hung up, I sat on the porch and watched rainwater race along the curb, carving little streams through months of accumulated dust. Somewhere in Phoenix, Ethan was probably trying to explain how the largest individual payout from one of the biggest deals of his career had ended up in a trust he would never touch. Somewhere closer, Hannah was probably asleep after another day spent caring for strangers during the hardest hours of their lives. 20 years earlier, I had accepted 8% of a roofing company instead of a raise I desperately needed. Financially, it became the best decision I ever made. But the $1.8 million wasn't what made it valuable. When I had almost nothing left, $2,100 in the bank, a surgery deadline, and no idea how I would pay for it, that old investment showed me something money usually hides. One of my children showed up when I had nothing to give back. The other showed up only after he discovered how much I was worth. If I had to make the choice again, I wouldn't change a dollar. I already knew who I would trust with my last $2,100 and who I wouldn't.